I'm Peggy Pirro, and this is Food From Here. Sponsored by Swerka and More and their intergenerational community garden partnership with Young and Established. Swerka and More works to enhance the quality of life for seniors in southern Indiana, promoting independent living and helping to relieve food insecurity in our community. Tucked into the small business district of Haynie's Corner in downtown Evansville is the Haynie's Corner Brewing Company, which was opened as the Evansville Brew House in 2016. The business has gone through a couple ownership changes and a name change in the intervening years, but one near constant has been my guest today, current owner Samantha Buente. Sam joined the business as a bartender just a few months after the brew house opened, and with the exception of a brief period during one of the ownership changes, she's been a part of the business ever since. Sam brings a vitality to the brewing company as well as to the entire Haynie's Corner neighborhood. If there's an event happening in the district, Sam's probably involved. She's currently the president of the Haynie's Corner Neighborhood Association, the group that organizes First Fridays and Front Porch Fest and the June Pride Parade. She and I sat down on a recent morning to talk about community and food and what's happening in the neighborhood, and of course, beer. It was a fun conversation. I think you're going to enjoy it. Also in this episode, an unexpected food pairing to try out with your craft beer. I'll share that with you after the interview. Now, here's my conversation with Sam Buente of Haynie's Corner Brewing Company. Samantha, welcome to Food From Here.
Thanks for having me.
I wanted to get you in the chair and talk about your childhood.
Have you been talking to my therapist?
I wonder if we could start, though, by you telling me what you ate when you were a kid.
Sure. Well, I grew up in western Massachusetts in the Berkshire Mountains. I grew up as close to Vermont as we are right now to Henderson, Kentucky from Evansville. So a really culturally interesting area, different obviously from here. But the community I grew up in is really diverse, probably Polish forward in terms of food. Although there's certainly a lot of Italian influence and then some Irish influence, of course, that's kind of flooded over from Boston. So but then, it all just kind of becomes hill towns there at that point. So I grew up with a Polish great-grandmother, so Ethel Kujawiński. So that some of those Polish recipes were definitely handed through my family. So, pierogies, golumkis, things like that. But just kind of a lot of maybe fresher. It was a farming community. So, we'd always had a garden or a neighbor with a garden. And so going out and getting fresh food and fresh beef or meats from the farms. I didn't know about factory farming really till I got older because I'd only seen small town farming. And
right.
So it didn't really make sense to me, this idea of factory farming, until later in life. Yeah.
How large was the town?
Oh, gosh. So it's one of the largest landmass towns in Massachusetts. So it's called Coleraine, but it has less than 1,000 people in the whole town.
Very small. Then.
Very, very small. Yeah. It's super spread out, It's a real big mutual aid kind of place. You help your neighbors. You have a plow. Your neighbor has a truck. You figure it out. That kind of thing.
Did you have family meals?
Yeah, not at the table. But my mom was a single mom for the early part of my life, and then remarried, and so I spent my weekends in Vermont, and with my dad and my grandmother. And so my dad and my grandmother were big eat at the table people, but my mom was not so much. So, but we always ate together. So yeah. And I grew up, my best friend was the youngest of 6 kids, and they lived just up the road, which is unusual for such a rural area. So I grew up with basically, 5 older siblings and a built-in sister best friend. So they did meals at the table every night. And, they owned a huge dairy farm. So we would do huge farm picnic lunches, where you'd drag everything out in the field and meet them if they were, cutting hay or sowing corn or whatever you're doing. So that was definitely, I got some big family tastes along with my super small family.
Well, that sounds pretty idyllic.
Yeah,
for sure. Were any of your family members beer drinkers?
Yes. So beer in the New England culture is a kind of a staple, I would say, in a lot of ways. First of all, the Pilgrims, little known fact, they actually landed at Plymouth because they ran out of beer. They meant to go to the Hudson River. So, we started our Massachusetts traditions very strong right off the bat. And so growing up, especially so close to, New England's kind of small and smushed together, but being so close to Vermont has a huge history of really excellent craft breweries. And then, of course, you've got the Sam Adams Brewery, which kind of fell into a bunch of misinformation between Anheuser-Busch and Miller Coors trying to snuff them out. But they really are a kind of a grassroots small town brewery that has grown. And then Connecticut has a huge brewing history as well. A lot of they actually contract brew for a lot of really big breweries in Vermont. And I believe Connecticut was kind of responsible for maybe like selling some bootleg homebrewing supplies when homebrewing was illegal, and advocating for a lot of those laws to be changed to make homebrewing legal again in the United States. So grew up in a huge history of beer. Both my parents drink beer. I just always grew up around it. So it's never been weird to me to see beer.
Mm-hmm. When I was a kid, women drinking beer was, I'm going to say transgressive. Sure. Actually, it really was. Women didn't drink in public in my community.
Right.
And beer has always had class connotations, I suppose. Any thoughts on any of that?
Those are certainly all correct things that we hear in the world. Yeah, I am lucky that I grew up. I guess lucky. I don't know. Maybe somebody here may disagree, but I feel lucky for my current profession that I grew up around women that drank beer and also women that expected women to do whatever needed to be done. So, not so much, not so much of the division of labor ideals that we hear about. Women drank beer. Sometimes they drank wine. Sometimes the men drank wine. Sometimes everybody drank margaritas. And, it certainly can be a class connotation. The history of beer is so interesting. We started drinking beer because it wasn't poison, and the water in England was poisonous. So when those pilgrims landed here running out of beer, they immediately started brewing beer because they were, in their mind, the water would be poison. Now, it wasn't, because it wasn't as polluted yet as it was in London and wherever they were coming from. But that's why they were drinking beer. Even kids drank beer. It was under 3%. We have a sign in the brewery that says something about the water has bacteria in it, but beer doesn't. So beer is safer than water, and that comes from the roots of that beer and why we drank it. So. It was a staple at first. It was what everybody drank. And women made that beer, which is so interesting,
yes.
Until about the mid-1800s when things changed. I think we can probably blame or assign some of the changes in that into the rise of, bigger beer companies that pushed things in a certain way. But craft brewing had a resurgence in the 90s and then again in the mid to later 2000s. And I think that we've seen that idea of craft brewing as less of a classism, if anything, going the opposite way,
Correct.
Like well-educated people only drink craft beer. Well, listen, I love a good domestic beer myself too. You can't drink IPAs all day when you're mowing the lawn. So.
No. Can't drink IPAs all day, period.
Right. Right.
I came across this statistic that I wanted to share with you. This note I came across said that in the 70s there were fewer than 50 breweries in the United States. Mm-hmm. And in 1978, homebrewing was finally made legal. It was illegal.
Yes.
In the entirety of, well, I won't say the entirety, but most of our history as a country. Mm-hmm. Latest numbers show about 4,000 craft breweries, and the definition here is that they're unaffiliated with large commercial breweries, and they brew less than 6 million barrels a year.
That's a lot of barrels.
That's a lot of beer. Even so, but that category makes up 10% of the overall market,
sure.
Which is really big.
Yeah. There's some speculation that number is pretty stable right now and might dip a bit. I think that overall predictions are showing, that we saw a huge rush kind of right before COVID times in 2015, 2016, new breweries popping up everywhere. And so maybe that's stabled a bit and we might see some of those drop off. But overall, we're kind of out of this cycle of boom. But there are a lot of breweries that have been around for a while. So, but yes, that number was quite small in the 70s and that, of course, the home brewing is essential to commercial brewing, to learn recipe development, to learn the process, to learn the mechanics of it. I mean, I would say almost all of the work that goes into brewing is fixing something that's broken. So, so figuring out those mechanics, and you just can't have a good sustainable beer community without the homebrewers. And Evansville was a huge cornerstone of that 70s market, by the way. I mean, our brewing history here is deep and rich and was absolutely gutted by Prohibition. And it just took a long time for it to kind of stabilize. If you look at pre-Prohibition beer styles versus post-Prohibition beer styles, they're so different. And a lot of that can be attributed to the fact that, during Prohibition, beer companies pivoted to making sodas or making something like a shandy that would have, a little, maybe not no alcohol, but not, what we think of now. And so it shifted beer taste to be, more sweeter or flavored, or it's just very different from pre-Prohibition beer that you would have seen. And Evansville was right in the thick of that.
But do you think Prohibition had anything to do with the rise of soda pop drinking?
Oh, absolutely. Okay. Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's so interesting to see that those companies were just trying to survive and pushing that. It seems almost certain correlation, causation, I don't know. But
yeah. So you have been with the brewing company since it was the brew house, since it opened.
Since it opened, basically a month and a half in.
I want to say that was 2012?
We just did our 8th birthday, 2016.
Oh, okay. I had it a little earlier than that. Okay. Yeah. And you were there for a few years, and then you bought it.
Yeah.
How did that come about?
Well, so the brewing company was actually, so it was Evansville Brew House at the time, and Jeff Smith started that. He's a hobby brewer, also CFO of a local bank, and wanted to dip his toe into it. So he built what I was meant to be and has been its own kind of little capsule company. So, low cost, low space, low everything. And so I worked with Jeff starting about a month and a half into his ownership. At the time, he was actually doing most of the brewing, bartending, all of it, but he injured himself pretty badly while brewing. And so while he was gone, the person who was kind of managing it said, "Oh, can you come in and bartend?" I'd never bartended before ever, but I can talk to people and I can pour a beer. So seemed like a good combination. So worked for him for several years. In 2019, he actually sold it to an investor that had 2 partners that were working there. They had some beer experience and some bar experience. But I think that maybe the community aspect of the business was not necessarily recognized to its fullest potential. And so it wasn't a good fit. And so I ended up taking over at the end of, September of 2019. So it's just 6 months that I was absent. And then, just in time to shut everything down a couple of months later.
How did you stay afloat during the pandemic?
We really honed in on that community aspect, and so Jeff has taught me so much about beer and about owning a community space and about, facilitating that like third space aspect. But he was definitely deeply committed to his craft beer roots. And so I deeply respect and love our craft beer roots, but in the middle of a global pandemic, we started selling Miller Lite. Recognizing, like you said, you can't drink IPAs all day at all. When someone comes in, maybe they can have 2 or 3 craft beers that are higher alcohol or higher sugar, so that just metabolizes into drunkenness a little faster. But, so what we see is a lot of people come in, get a couple of our beers on draft, and then maybe shift to a Miller Lite if they want to hang out and, stay with their friends. It's something a little lower alcohol, lower sugar. So we really leaned into that. We were already set up for to-go sales. We have a crowler machine, so we can 24 ounces of beer at a time. We have growlers. We produced our own beer on site, so we avoided any kind of, draft shortage that there was throughout the country. And we, had some outdoor events, and Haynie's Corner is really well set up for that too. And we had a really, in February and March, I would have told you was inconvenient. In April, May, and June, it was amazing. Our road was actually shut down in front of the brewery, which if you were looking to find it on a regular basis would have been terrible. But it kind of provided an unofficial patio for us. So we would sell beer to go, and people would go, bring their chairs and hang out outside, and somebody might bring music, somebody might play music. But I think we, as a corner as a neighborhood really embraced the idea of taking care of one another, but also maintaining safe social aspects. So we didn't have any major problems with, COVID contagion or anything like that until restrictions had been kind of lifted everywhere. So we felt pretty good about how we were able to keep one another safe, but also make sure that people were, socially taken care of also. We actually, as a brewery, did not open our doors until a month after other places had opened because I just didn't feel good about it at that time. And then we actually kept mask restrictions for quite a bit longer as well.
How did that go over?
The thing with the consumption is you're walking in with a mask and then you're taking it off. And so for us, I think the patrons actually, gosh, it's so long ago and then it feels like it was just yesterday. Patrons, we kind of dropped that, but the bartenders, we kept masked up for a little bit longer. And the rationale behind that was just, and I'm not a scientist, but thinking like if I'm talking to 100 people in a day, I'm breathing in their air. And so I don't want to pass it on to the one person that at a time. So being kind of the mutual connector point. And so we had good luck with that. We didn't have a lot of problems.
Did you have to do anything with your permitting to get outside so people could sit outside?
So it was not our seating. So that's the loophole. So we have a carryout permit as a brewery. And so we were just able to sell that beer to go, and then in public space is where they settled.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I was glad to see you survive. And people employed all kinds of different tactics and strategies to get through that time. And I think the calling on your community and being in it and being of it can often make or break.
Absolutely.
Economic times.
In some ways, it served as a great reset. 2019, the expectations for entertainment had really kind of surpassed what a little nano brewery is capable of providing, in terms of music or, we have terrible acoustics. We're an old garage. We're an old laundromat, and things like that. And so the idea of just community being enough is where we really excel. And so that reset probably really helped us to actually take a minute and connect, and also offered me a time to show, here's what I'm like as a business owner. Here's how I want to serve the community.
Yeah. I want to talk about the specifics of beer a little bit because there's so many different kinds. And I don't know anything. I know what I like,
Sure.
But
that's important.
When someone tries to describe what a beer is or tastes like, or some of the language that they use, it's not as complex as wine or even coffee.
Oh gosh, no.
But it still has a language, a jargon, a vocabulary all its own. So I'm wondering if I can just throw some beer words out at you and you can tell me what. Okay, what's a Pilsner?
So a Pilsner is going to be, and so here's the thing: if you're a beer lover listening to this, a beer enthusiast, I'm gonna explain this in people terms.
Yes.
Because my goal is always that if someone comes in and they want a craft beer, they're not comfortable with craft beer, or they know, I've had a couple craft beers and I like, but I don't know the specifics, just like you just said. We never want to make them feel dumb. We never want to make them feel like beer is pretentious. That's been my experience at some breweries. Luckily, not locally. We have great breweries locally, but you go some places and they're like, well, a Pilsner is, and they'll give you the definition. It's like, listen, I'm going to tell you, it sounds like you enjoy a light beer that's got some bready tones in it. Tastes a little bit like a baguette or a bagel, and it's going to be refreshing. So that's what it sounds like you like. I don't have a Pilsner. Let's try this Helles lager that I have that's, similar, trying to find something that matches that a little bit.
What's a pale ale?
So pale ale is going to be, people mix up IPA and pale ale a lot. So pale ale, I would describe to the masses as IPA light. So there's definitely, it's an American pale ale. It's going to be a little bit different in terms of the hop profile, but it won't likely be as sharp or as high volume alcohol as an IPA can be.
What's a stout?
So stouts are stouts are what got me into craft beer. So I love a stout. So stouts are going to be a rounder, darker tones, darker beer typically there are pale stouts. Don't get me started on that, but typically a darker beer with a rounder kind of flavor. Some of them have a little bit of like an alcohol taste on the end as a finisher. Some of them don't. There can be some good roasted tones, although if we get too roasted, we get into more porter territory. And so that's where, if you have a more chocolate tones roasted, so that's going to be more porter, but you can get some of that in stout.
The chocolate tones were what I was going to ask you. What is that beer?
That's a malt. There's a chocolate malt. So we're not actually putting chocolate in, in things. So we have a red ale that we serve. It's called Dan Gets to Name It. Dan has never named this beer, so it's Dan Gets to Name It. and so that's made with chocolate malt. And so actually our red ale has some good chocolate tones in it, which people get kind of confused about that. So they're like, is there chocolate in this or coffee? No, it's the chocolate malt.
So beer is brewed from grains.
Yes.
See, this I know. What grains are used?
So there's all different kinds of grains. And actually that grain bill is what we call that, is what develops the flavor of the beer. So if you use more of a lighter, less roasted grain or less roasted malt, you're going to get lighter flavors. If you use a darker grain or darker malt, you're going to get those darker, rounder flavors. So we buy our grains from a company in Minnesota that has them. That malting process, they take care of all of that. The malting process is, harvesting the grains and then roasting them, and that's far more complicated than I'm qualified to talk about.
Do they ferment or age or anything?
The malting process is what the process that they're going through. Yeah, yep. And so so we buy our grains from that company, already malted and already categorized for us. The grains are crushed. So we do some of the crushing. We buy the grains pre-crushed. Some of it we do in-house. And that allows for the water to go into the sugars in the inside of the grain. So when you crack that grain open and then you soak that in hot water, it allows the sugar to come out, which is later what feeds the yeast. So that's we develop a grain bill. That's kind of the heart and soul of the beer. And then the next part of where you kind of get a lot of those beer flavors is from the mashing process. And so mashing is when you soak the grains in hot water. And then later use that grain bed as a filtration system to put more water through. But that hot water, that hot grain leaches out all the sugar water. And so depending on the temperature of the water and how long you let it mash, that's going to affect the flavor of your beer as well. And then we take all that and we boil it. And then once that's boiled to a certain degree, we're adding, any hops that we have, flavorings that people might want to add. You can add flavorings at a couple different parts of the process. And then basically it gets conditioned, and conditioning can take up to, 2 to 4 weeks. It could take 2 to 4 months. A lager, this is, also called lagering or fermenting. The longer, so if you're lagering, it's taking longer. It's sitting there longer and conditioning itself. You condition at a higher temperature first and then drop that temperature. And so once that's done, we add carbonation, any flavors that you might want to add at the end, and it gets kegged. That's the most basic possible way of describing it.
Yeah. Hops.
Uh-huh.
Is that a grain or is that a different kind of plant?
A hops is a different kind of plant. It's actually related to marijuana.
Oh,
so
a friend of mine gave me some. They're pretty.
They are pretty.
I had never seen them before.
Yeah.
What do they add?
Bitterness.
Okay.
Yeah, that's where the bitterness comes in.
Okay, so when somebody says a beer tastes hoppy, they mean it's got bitter overtones, undertones, however.
Right. Yeah. And so different hops have different levels of bitterness, and you can add more or less kind of depending on what you're aspiring to make there. So all beer has hops in them in some way. It just kind of depends on what type of hops you're using. We use Galaxy hops in our IPA, and so it's a higher bitter. And then there are some, there are hops in our blonde, but those are going to be a lower hoppiness.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are all these Midwestern grains and plants?
They're not. No.
Okay.
There are some places that there are some great providers of those of hops and grains, but they are so specialty that it's difficult for us as a little guy to get a hold of those. But we have talked about doing an all Indiana mash. There's some breweries in Indiana that do only use Indiana products. I think they're really cool. It's just not a place that we've gotten ourselves to yet.
So you use a lot of grains.
We do.
And then what do you do with the spent grains?
We have a farmer that takes them, actually.
Okay. And they compost?
They feed it to the cows and chickens.
It. Does it have any alcohol content?
No.
Oh, okay.
No, that's just the hot water. It's been soaked in it, and that's it. So it's perfectly safe. Hops are poisonous to animals, so we never want to give any hops to anybody.
Okay. But that comes at the end of the process anyway.
That would never get it. Yep.
So you end up with a lot of spent grains, and somebody comes and just takes them and adds them to their.
Yep.
I like that.
Yeah, so it's a pretty zero waste process there.
Yeah. Otherwise, you would have a lot to dispose
Oh gosh,
of.
it's so much to get rid of. Yeah.
Is this common for breweries to
Yes.
partner with a local farm?
Absolutely. Yeah. And we've got a couple different people. The farmer's our first choice. Farmer Jimmy, he comes and gets everything for us. We've also had a worm farm that has loved to take them. They can take less, but they tell me that the worms reproduce wildly when they're fed these crates.
Oh.
So some kind of worm aphrodisiac. I don't know. And then we do sometimes have people that just want a shovel or two to put in their compost.
I wanted to ask you, I know a lot of your beer is your own, but you also, as you said, sell bottled beer from other brewers. And you were involved in a glass recycling project.
Yeah.
Is that still going on? And how is it going?
So I try to actually avoid glass when I can. I stick to aluminum as much as possible because of that, the lack of recycling options for glass. So we do recycle all of our glass. We partnered with our Academy and 6 and 0 when they were doing their big glass project. And we're hopeful that will come back so that we don't have to drive as far. But right now we do bring all of our glass to other local recycling areas that do accept glass. So, Mars Recycling takes glass, so we bring some to them. I don't think I can disclose my other sources because
it's fine. It has been an ongoing
absolutely
inconvenience to try to recycle
it's terrible.
glass, which is, I don't know that much about glass production either, probably less than I know about beer production, but I do know that it's recyclable and far more recyclable than plastic.
Sure. It's definitely frustrating. And it just is so heavy that for a small business, I mean, that's a huge cost to have it carted away.
Yeah.
So, we really work hard to produce as little waste as we can.
But you do sell in cans, and there is a ready aluminum recycling.
Yes, it's our only cans. We have our only cans recycling.
Yeah. Tell me about that. Say more about that.
It's just the label on our trash can says, "Thank you for supporting our only cans." So come in and recycle a can with us. You never know what you'll find.
There has been, probably in the last 20 years or so, a growing segment of the industry that's really focused on local brewing rather than trying to scale up for widespread distribution in supermarket shelf space and so on. Can you talk a little bit about the benefits and the challenges of that if your goal is not to scale up but to stay small?
Sure. So Indiana has some great small brewer friendly laws that have been deeply advocated for by some of our larger small breweries, Sun King being one of them. They're, deeply involved in the legislative process. And so we can self-distribute. So we could, so even as a small brewery, without signing any kind of distribution agreement, without having any supermarket deals, anything like that, we can sell a keg of our beer to anyone with an alcohol license to be sold on premises. So I could pick any local sports bar, any local hot wings place and sell them a keg of beer, and they can put it on draft and sell it. So that is nice. We've not been in a place where we've produced at a level where we wanted to do that. Our system is small. We produce about 100 gallons at a time, and we're pretty busy. So we tend to go through that, on our own. But it is nice to know that we do have that ability, should we want to self-distribute within wherever we want to drive to, basically.
Yeah.
So, I've looked very little into larger distribution. It's just certainly with production equipment that's our size, it's not feasible. And I think that anybody who tries that is really admirable. I mean, it's a big push. So you're signing distribution agreements and you're canning your beer. And I talked about how something's always broken. Well, I mean, that just adds a whole other set of equipment that can be broken.
Yeah.
There's some mobile canning companies that will come in and can for you. Our space is not conducive to that. I mean, we're literally in the size of a garage. Our brewery is anyway. So it's not on my agenda. I would prefer to keep it local and, see where the beer is. We're open to some self-distribution, and we've done a little bit of it in the past, kind of more like on demand. But there's a lot of risk in that too. So, and I'm a intentional grower as a business person. I would never want to take on a huge endeavor that might end up sinking me.
I always wanted to stay small when I had Penny Lane. I always wanted to just be one location.
Yeah.
And if we got into roasting great, we had a little garage we could have accessed,
Sure.
but that was as big as I ever wanted to be because my point was to be a neighborhood
Right.
business.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it
Well, and I
depends.
work full time besides having the brewery. So I don't have that. My husband also works full time. So, so we've got a lot of irons in the fire. So it would not be feasible. The nice thing about the brewery now is that there's not a pressure to make sure that we're, paying ourselves a salary. So it would be lovely to get to that point, but it's, we make sure that our staff is taken care of. And from there's not a lot of pressure to make sure that we are in a growing state.
Is it sustainable as it is? Does it pay for itself?
It does,
basically? Okay.
yeah. And it always has, which is nice. And a lot of that is the way that Jeff set it up. It does take care of itself, which is really my goal. Like I said, it'd be nice to get it to the point where it could do a little more than that. But we're able to give back to the community in ways that are important to us. We are able to employ people in a way that's important to us and pay them, fairly. And so growth isn't not necessarily what I would be focused on at this particular point.
Let's talk a little bit more about women in the brewing industry.
It's not a lot of us.
Women, as you mentioned earlier, women were the main brewers until the 1600s.
I think it's more about the 1800s, although men certainly took credit for it.
Well, it's dominated by men now, the entire industry.
It is. Bearded men, white men largely. So
even in those companies where the CEO is a woman, there are very few female brewmasters, the person who's in there with the hands in the grains. The number I saw was 4%.
That probably feels generous.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about women in the brewing industry. What are your thoughts?
I think that if you even looked at numbers of women CEOs, it would be a very low number. And of course, just in the patterns that we put ourselves into, we tend to hire the people that are most like us, that kind of thing. So, for example, most of our bartenders are women about my age. So, I see the patterns in myself. And I think that brewing is a physical job, and I think that there's a stereotype that women can't handle a physical job. I don't think that's true, but I can, I think that's probably where a gentle statement would come from, is someone trying to give themselves credit. Oh, women can't, but it is definitely a male-dominated field. I feel fortunate. Within our community here, we have other women that are involved in brewing, and we're all deeply supportive of one another. But the microaggressions are not easy. I go by Sam a lot. And so all of the communication that any of our distributors get comes from Sam. And so I cannot tell you the number of salespeople that I have caught off guard by them showing up to meet Sam and finding out that I am in fact Samantha. And the way that communication changes once they know that is really interesting. And of course, I hear all the time, oh, that's not happening. Oh, they didn't mean that. But that's the microaggression of being a woman in a male dominated field. Yeah. So.
You mentioned the local brewing community. We're doing okay right now. There's you, there's Damsel, there's Barker.
Taroni's,
Taroni's, the OG, right?
Yeah, and then in the vicinity, we've got some good stuff too. We've got Henderson Brewing Company, then Yard Goat and Jasper, St. Benedict's Brewing, Vincennes Brewing. So our region is doing okay, yeah. There's always room for more.
You think?
Yeah, call me. Let's open another brewery. Not mine. I mean, you open another brewery. But
and we've lost a couple.
We have.
Tin Man and Carson's are the two that come to mind. Yeah. But things feel kind of stable, maybe, and solid.
We've got a really good community of craft beer drinkers here. Our homebrewers club is thriving. They are hosted through Damsel. Damsel hosts the homebrewers, and they've got contests and membership drives, and I think that community is poised to really keep us kind of going in terms of our craft beer community. They do a lot of work advocating for beer in the community as homebrewers. So I think that, I would say that we're pretty stable. I do think there's room for more. That might sound counterintuitive, like why would you want more competition? But it doesn't feel like competition. Anytime somebody moves in, there's maybe a growing pain or establishing communication. But truly, we all help one another. If I run out of a grain, I will call Damsel, or I will call Myriad, or I will call Barker. Merle at Taroni's is my hops guy. If I find out, oh shoot, we're doing this recipe and I thought I had these hops and I don't, Merle often has that. So we can work something out there and, replenish that or whatever. So it is very, very collaborative.
Yeah, good.
We keep in touch on price increases or best practices or who can you get hops through that's got a deal right now. And so it's a really nice community. And I would really like to bring some more people into that. I really would.
Do you have a formal local association?
We don't.
It's just an informal network.
Chit chat. Yeah. So when Tin Man was thriving, they restarted the Evansville Brewing Alliance. But that has kind of been given to me, but not in a formal sense. So I would love to, add that to the checklist of things that I need to get done, and formally reviving that again, seeing what we could do. We're really lucky. We've just got our local sports bars support, craft beer. Our local brew pub kind of places are always willing to support, and not necessarily in carrying that beer, although they certainly do that as well, but offering, thoughts on trends, or, we've got mechanics in the community that will come fix something for me. So it's a really deeply supportive community in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Yeah. You are a busy woman, Sam. You have really become an anchor in that Haynie's Corner neighborhood. President of the Arts District Association,
yes,
correct?
Mm-hmm.
And that association organizes First Fridays.
Yep, from Porch Fest, pumpkin carving,
wiffle
ball. Yes, although we do have some wiffle ball commissioners that take that off my plate. We've got Pride Music Night. So we've got a busy calendar of events. I think there's something nearly every month of the year. So
and you're at a brewing company itself. Mm-hmm. You have regular events, a trivia
yes.
night.
We've got trivia night, several book clubs. We have a silent book club that meets. There's no discussion. You sit silently for 45 minutes and read a book. It's popular amongst parents. No one's going to talk to you for 45 minutes, I promise.
Yeah. And as you mentioned, you have a full-time job.
I do, yes.
So what motivates you?
A lot of the Haynie's Corner stuff has been about making the community that I live in what I want to live in. So I moved to Haynie's Corner 2014, 15, I think 14. And so immediately got involved in that, and just, wanted to really dive in. This is my 7th season for First Fridays. There had been so much work done before me, and, I will reach this point eventually too. So much work was done before me, but they were ready for the next thing. Mm-hmm. And so I had some ideas on how to make the events bigger or more accessible or more involved. And we've really seen those kind of come to fruition in the last couple of years.
I like the turn that First Fridays has taken this year.
Yeah.
I like blocking that section of Washington Avenue off.
Yeah.
It makes it feel so much
more connected. That's been a goal for years,
nice.
But my number one piece of advice for anyone wanting to plan an event is that you can't make people go where they don't want to go. And it's better to start with a smaller space that's full than have too large of a space that's empty. So we've built up from about 25 vendors to 125 vendors in the last 5 years.
No kidding.
So yeah. And we curate all those vendors through the Arts Council. They help manage all of the art vendors. But, it's a lot of work to make sure no one's selling, reselling purses. And there's a time and a place for that. It's just not what we want at our event. So,
right.
It's been a long road to get there. And finally, we feel like we can actually do that.
You were on the board of directors of the Gender Warriors organization.
Yeah.
Does that group still exist?
It does not. Gender Warriors existed as an LGBTQ advocacy group before there was River City Pride, before there was Greater Evansville Youth, before there was, now we have a budding PFLAG chapter. So yeah, Gender Warriors kind of filled in that gap, doing education in particular. And the world was different then. So things have changed, some ways bad and some ways good for the LGBTQ community. But definitely there are more resources now than there ever were.
You're still involved with the Greater Evansville Youth, yes?
I am, yes. Okay. I was on the board. I am a community volunteer with them now. They announced last week that they actually will be joining forces or powered by Indiana Youth Group. So IYG out of Indianapolis is poised to add 3 full-time positions, including mental health care for LGBTQ youth and young adults. So they're adding a lot of positions and, really investing in the area. And that's such an exciting growth opportunity for them. But for me, it felt like they needed board members that could be really committed. And I was afraid that my time would prevent me from being able to give what I need to.
But you're so good at it.
Thank you.
I'm going to put links to those organizations in the show notes so that if people who are interested can find out more.
That's great.
Haynie's Corner has experienced a rejuvenation, I would say, over the last 20 years. But, it's always been 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And perhaps that's common anytime a community goes through changes.
Sure.
That things get spearheaded and then you take a breath and you have to regroup and then continue. I wondered if you could say anything about the Alhambra.
I wish I could. The Alhambra is privately owned.
Yes.
I don't know of any current plans to manage that. It's such a beauty.
It is. And as long as I have lived here, people have had hopes for the Alhambra, and it has never come to fruition.
Right.
So you're just going to leave us in that space.
I wish I had more. I wish I had more. Yeah, there's been a lot of growth, though. I'm really pleased. I think that the step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Sometimes it is a step back, and sometimes I think it is. I think mostly it's normal. We've had about 4 steps forward recently, and then maybe half a shuffle back. And I think that what's unique about Haynie's Corner is that it is one of our most walkable kind of microcosms in Evansville. And so everything happens within that bubble. And so when something succeeds, it succeeds in a big way. And when something doesn't succeed, it happens under a microscope of everybody seeing it, in real time. Mm-hmm. So I think it's really normal. If you look at, pick any strip mall and look at what comes and goes there, I think you'll see actually probably less stable businesses than we have in Haynie's Corner. But we've been so excited lately to have Spanky's Una Cafe open. Yes. They've just started serving some breakfast stuff too. And then the yoga studio above that. So, and then, so we're going to see some changes, I think, in the Shimmick's Kitchen. They've recently stopped regular service, but they've been doing some private events. And I think that we'll see some changes making that more accessible pretty soon.
Yeah,
so
I look forward to that.
Yeah. So there's always room for more. Walton's is open for purchase. Sorry, that was poorly worded. So Walton's is for sale. Right. Yeah. And so, but Fidel's is still open above it. So there's some real opportunities. And I think, places like Shimmick's Kitchen and Walton's really pushed Haynie's Corner forward to a place where, now there can be the next level. There can be the next thing.
And I think that's a great note to leave it on.
Wonderful.
Sam, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure. Come see us in Haynie's Corner sometime. We've always got something going on for you.
And I have an update to this episode. In the time between the recording of my conversation with Sam and its upload, glass recycling is once again available in Vanderburgh County through a drop-off program at Tri-State Recovery. I'll link to details in the show notes. Up next, an unconventional food pairing to try with your craft beer. Food From Here is sponsored by Swerka and More, working to enhance the quality of life for seniors in southern Indiana, promoting independent living and helping to relieve food insecurity in our community through their intergenerational community garden partnership with Young and Established. So we all know what goes with beer, right? Salty things like chips and salsa and pretzels and nacho cheese dip. But I'm going to offer you a somewhat unconventional beer pairing that just might make it onto your list of favorites. Are you ready? Stuffed figs. Okay, now stay with me here. These figs are a perfect melding of sweet and salty and crunchy because they're stuffed with goat cheese and they're topped with walnuts, and it's all robust enough to stand up to a hearty craft beer. But it also goes really well with Prosecco or a light wine. Here's how to do it. You'll want 4 to 6 fresh figs, a couple ounces of goat cheese, a couple tablespoons of roughly chopped walnuts, and some honey. Cut off the stem of each fig and then cut them down from the top about halfway through, turning them 90 degrees, and then cut them halfway through again. You're making an X. Divide the goat cheese among the figs, spooning it down into the center, and then press some walnuts into the cheese. Drizzle it all with a little bit of honey, and put them under the broiler just long enough to melt the cheese a bit and get some color on them. Or you can set them on a hot grill for a few minutes until the cheese melts. I'll leave a recipe for you in the show notes. Let me know if you try it and what you drink with it. And that's our show for today. For our final episode of the summer season, I'll be talking about home cooking with friend of the pod, Nina Bambina. Nina grew up spending part of her summers every year in Sicily, and she still makes regular trips there. We'll be talking about the Sicilian summer table and fresh ricotta and olive oil and, of course, tomatoes. I hope you'll join us in 2 weeks for that. And remember, you can always let us know what's on your mind or on your table with an email to foodfromhere@wnin.org. You can share your suggestions for future guests or future topics, and let me know what and where you're eating this summer. That's foodfromhere@wnin.org. Food From Here is produced at Tri-State Media in downtown Evansville, home of WNIN-FM and WNIN PBS, with support from Swerka and More and from listeners like you. I'm Peggy Pirro. Thanks for listening.